Hey everyone, welcome back to VR for another AW Nite SF, where we will be focusing this month's show on one of the most talked about topics in tech right now, the metaverse. Um, so I'm Young. You can find your emojis on your menu. So if you want to just send up some emojis to let me know that you've got your emojis working. All right. So how many of you have been to an all-night event before? Oh, great. About to how many of you have been to a speaker event? One person. Wow, okay. Great, then welcome. So who's in VR right now? Anyone in VR? How about desktop? Here we got one person on desktop. Great. So welcome to all of you. So for those who don't know, All Night SF is part of the greater augmented reality expo family, and it's world's #1 spatial computing event series that with conferences and expos including US, Europe, and Asia, and supports 16 independently run all nights around the world. So All Night SF has been around for 9 years now. In the past, we met physically in real space in San Francisco, such as the Microsoft Reactor. But most likely for the remainder of this year, we'll be hosting virtual events in All Space VR or another virtual event space. But stay tuned for more physical events to come. So hopefully next year we'll have some physical events. But the conference this year will be physical in Santa Clara. So you can join the conversation on all the social channels using hashtag AllNightSF. So please post about the event. We just surpassed 4,800 members and we really want to hit 5,000. So spread the word. We're also going to be recording tonight's events so you can relive the awesomeness and share with all your friends. So another thing that I want to mention is the conference, AW conference is happening in November this year. And we have a special discount code that offers 20% off both 3-day and 2-day all access passes for the All Night SF community. So just type in All Night SF 20D and checkout and get your 20% discount. One more thing, if you want to get into the conference for free, you can actually volunteer. So if you volunteer for half a day, then you can access that day's event for free, rest of the day. So I know they're still looking for volunteers to participate. And I just want to share that when I first started getting into AR in 2018, I volunteered for their conference in 2018. And it was really a great experience. I connected with all kinds of great people and that I'm still connected to this day. And especially for those of you who are new to this industry, it's a great way to get a jump start. Just finding out more about, what people are working on, what companies are doing what, as well as just making great connections. So I would highly, highly recommend it. And finally, just a few final housekeeping points. All audience members will remain muted throughout the event. During the Q&A session, feel free to use the raise hand feature and we will try and call on you. So after the Q&A, we'll remove the bleachers, then you'll have about an hour or so to mingle and network. So we'll keep the space open till about 3 p.m. today. So, okay, are you guys ready to kick off the show? So I'm going to hand this off to our co-organizer. Please welcome Mike Boland of AW Nite and Chief Analyst at Artillery Intelligence and editor of AR Insider, who will be moderating tonight's panel. Please welcome Mike and the panelists. Take it away, Mike.
Young. Sure. First of all, can you hear me okay? Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes.
Cool, cool.
I hear
So,
you.
first, a few kind of quick notes of housekeeping. So a few of our panelists aren't here yet on stage. Our Avi Barzev was having some sound issues on his Valve Index, but he's going to be trying to join and may sort of join us mid-conversation here on stage. And then second, do we have Lady PheOnix? Is she? Did you? If are you out there somewhere? Did you join late? If so, feel free to join us on stage. Just walk right up. You should have the host permissions to do so. And then another thing, before we jump into it, sort of occurs to me, which is interesting. Is anyone here out there based in San Francisco now, in the real world, where you're sitting? So I don't know if you're hearing it, but I completely forgot it until about 20 seconds ago, as I'm hearing jet engines blast past my window, that this is Fleet Week here in San Francisco. Um, so if suddenly you hear an echo, or if we have to kind of stop for noise issues, it's due to the F-15s that are screaming by our windows. Um, but anyway, that was sort of, you always hear that sort of first, when Fleet Week is here, when you hear that first plane go by. That happened for me about 20 seconds ago. So anyway, let's get right into it. So the metaverse, obviously a very hot topic, a very contentious topic. A lot of people have very strong opinions about what this sort of concept is, or what it should be, this thing we're calling the metaverse. So to sort of preempt the discussion, one thing I'll say is that we won't necessarily be defining the metaverse in certain terms, because I think it's sort of a fool's errand to do so, because it's so early, it's so conceptual, it's going to be such a moving target. Even the term itself. I was listening to the Nite New York event that happened recently, and Avi Barzev was on that panel. And one of the things he mentioned is, it could someday be like the term cyberspace, right? That ends up being so sort of dated. So it's interesting that the concept itself, the terminology, all these things are moving targets. I guess that's my point. But even though we won't be defining it, I think it's still very much a good thought exercise to sort of tease out what are the sort of conceptual elements, what are the models, what are the things we should be looking at. There are a few sort of models in today's world that could provide sort of a framework or a foundation, the web being one of them. The web has sort of interoperability and standards. There are also a lot of metaverse-like fiefdoms out there. We have things like Fortnite that people often point to, or Roblox, or we're sitting in one of them right now with AltSpace. So hopefully we're being very meta by doing this event here in AltSpace. But anyway, I'll stop rambling. That's just sort of to sort of preamble or preempt our discussion. So we have our esteemed panel that we're going to kind of find out what they're up to and what their thoughts are on this whole thing. So why don't we start with quick intros for each of you, a little bit about sort of who you are and what your role is. So why don't we start with you, Ryan?
Sure. So my name is Ryan Kopinsky. I got into AR in 2013 when Google Glass was launched, and I'm fully aware that Glass may not really be a true AR device, but that really piqued my interest. Since then, I actually created an app for Google Glass. Then I did a PhD dissertation for the U.S. military learning human robot interfaces, and I've done stuff with HoloLens. Well, that sound is really loud. Yeah, I've done stuff with HoloLens, and now I am really most of my time I'm focused on Apple AR. I'm sure many of you have heard about the rumors of a Apple headset, a mixed reality and VR headset, launching within the next year, and glasses within the next 3 to 4 years. And so that's really been my focus, and I'm really excited to be here.
Excellent. And you have a pretty prolific YouTube channel. How can people find that? It's Reality School is just the name of the channel.
Yeah, so the channel is called Reality School. You can find it at youtube.com/reality school.
Nice. Great. So thank you. Anar, a bit about yourself and what you're up to.
Yeah, so excited to be here. I've been to On Night in New York several times. So this is my first time doing it virtually. So happy to be here. And I primarily focus on digital fashion at the moment. So AR is a very important, AR and VR both, a very important context to actually get to experience virtual fashion. So I'm currently focused on building a customization engine called Armoire. And I'm also the host of the Digital Fashion and Art Show on Clubhouse, where we talk with leading professionals within the field and also creators of virtual fashion about their vision of the metaverse, their creative And I got into AR and VR almost by accident. I used to work and produce music and tech festivals, and the Wave XR team was doing actually their very first demo at Form Arcosanti, which was a festival in Arizona, and I was completely captivated by the technology that they were presenting. And since that point on, since 2016, I've been in this field, and I'm very excited to dive into this conversation. I think I also will preemptively say that I'm not going to attempt to define the metaverse, but I am also very excited to discuss all of the ideas that it is birthing at this moment.
And actually, definitions are okay. I don't mean to say we have but we don't want to give definitions, but just to set everyone's expectations that we won't be necessarily defining it in certain terms today. But thank you. That's very interesting. Of course, events and music and festivals and fashion, all things that I think are going to be important components in the metaverse. So why don't we start out at a high level, and then we'll drill down into some of the things you guys are working on. So high level, again, not necessarily to define it, but what are some of the things that you believe should be components of this thing that we're all calling the metaverse that may not be here for years or decades, but what are some of the components that you believe that it should possess? So for example, one thing that people often point to is interoperability. So there aren't sort of walled gardens. And again, the web can be sort of a model for that. There are other things such as, privacy and identity and other components. So what are the sort of hot button components for both of you when you sort of envision this thing we're calling the metaverse and what you believe it should or shouldn't possess? Ryan, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So for me, I mean, obviously, right now, if you think of it in terms of marketing speak, we've seen that everything right now is called the metaverse, right? A virtual world, the metaverse, an avatar, the metaverse, a game, the metaverse, and that's it's kind of misleading or maybe misguiding. But what I believe is the metaverse from a technical perspective, it is the infrastructure that will make our internet more immersive, where we will stop experiencing, our digital life and being through a window that is, for example, a screen, right? So most of our interaction with the internet, even if it is spatial, has been through a glass 2D window. And I think the metaverse will allow us to really enter immersive spaces and not only have everything isolated in a closed ecosystem, but be able to actually move value across ecosystems. So most of you, I'm sure, have heard of Web3. It is a term that is used very much these days. NFTs are used a lot. And I think, the hype aside, what those allow is if I buy a skin in Fortnite, I can also use it in my meeting in Meet and VR or VR chat. And being able to move value across ecosystems, that's really hints at the interoperability factor. I think that's going to be a really important part of the infrastructure. But one thing I've seen recently is now we're starting to see director of metaverse or chief metaverse officer, and that to me is it might be actually a real thing. But I think what we really have to look at is what does the metaverse entail from a marketing perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, from a DevOps perspective. And I think right now we're at just like the very, very beginning of creating this spatial internet.
Yeah, and I think you brought up some really good points that I want to circle back to, including sort of the identity and avatars and interoperability of how those might work across different sort of proprietary areas or walled gardens. So a lot of sort of existential stuff there that we can get into. But first, let's hear from you, Anar, on the same question. What are some of the, if not strict definitions, some of the components that you believe that this concept should have and people shouldn't be forgetting about when we're all sort of visualizing this future?
Yeah, well, just to set the backdrop, I mean, I think so many of us are still sometimes fighting with our printer machines to even get them to work correctly, as we're also starting to talk about the metaverse and the next iteration of what it's going to look like. So to tread gently, metaverse in my mind is the interface with virtual content that we printed on a page and trying to imagine what it actually looks like, but being able to visualize consume content that, is not, you're not presenting it in like a stitched sequence of scenes, but you're able to be within the scene yourself and kind of play an important role within the context of the entertainment that you're actually consuming. And the the most important thing for me is that we don't build the internet off of the mistakes that we've already encountered in Web 2 and repeat them in Web 3. So if we have learned, anything about privacy and misinformation and how impactful that is on our social dynamics, like being able to protect people that participate within metaverse environments and have information that is vetted and safe, and that we essentially develop systems and processes to actually protect people that participate in virtual context would be very important. So as much of these things we can anticipate ahead of time, I think that's going to improve the quality of experiences people have in the metaverse.
Yeah, that's great. And to sort of synthesize some of the comments you guys both made, this could be something that doesn't necessarily replace web as we know it grows from it. And I think looking at it that way allows us to sort of cherry pick, for lack of a better term, the components and the structures and the frameworks of the web, i.e., interoperability, common standards like HTTPS, and common languages like HTML, and the fact you can freely bounce from place to place. But that said, Web 2 isn't perfect, to your point, Inara. So is this an opportunity to sort of rethink or hit the reset button on a lot of those things about the web that don't work, whether that be inequity or lack of privacy? So I guess the question, boiling that down to a question, is is the web the right model? And what are the things about the web that we would like to change or make better, now that we have the opportunity to do so at this sort of inflection point? Why don't we start again with you, Ryan?
Sure. So I think the web is a good blueprint for the technical infrastructure that may be needed. Of course, we'll need a lot of edge compute power. Of course, we'll need 5G, speeds to be able to stream things very fast. But I think the most innovation that Web3 can have is in the economy. If we think of the citizens of the internet right now, there's a few types of citizens. I think being a creator and an internet entrepreneur, I think that's one of the most important, because we tend to create value at scale. And right now, creators don't have any equity in the platforms for which they create value, and that is a crime. Um, the time that I spend on YouTube, some videos take 60 hours for me to create, and I have zero equity in the infrastructure that distributes and leverages my content. And so I think what we can definitely take, a new, healthy approach to is how we design the economy and what protocols we create to actually at least have partial ownership over the infrastructure for which we generate value.
That makes sense. So more equity for creators. Absolutely. Anar, your thoughts on that same question?
I think whenever we start to talk about what the metaverse should look like or how we should consider designing it, I think it's very important to give the users that are going to be spending time within this environment to have authorship and the ability to actually create for this space, because we can imagine all we want, what we want the metaverse to look like, but I think it's communities and users themselves that have very specific needs and desires, how they want to be represented in those spaces, the types of infrastructure that they would like to build. So I think it's all about who gets to build the metaverse and for what reasons, because if the infrastructure to lay down the foundation of the metaverse is only in the hands of a few corporations, then we will probably have a very the diversity of the metaverse is going to be lacking, because it's going to be built using the imagination of the few for the benefit of the many. So I am really inspired to just bring in more and more architects and people to equip them with skills to actually participate in the building of the metaverse, because right now things kind of feel a little bit like homebrewers club. There's a lot of people that are interested in this. They are tinkering with different solutions, and as much as we would like to think that the metaverse is here, I think it's still very much in its nascent stages. So equipping people with the skills that they need to participate, I think, is going to be the most important part, the most important job that we have as metaverse advocates.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point about sort of centralized versus decentralized sort of planning and architecting this whole thing. We often talk about this as if it's, some committee that's going to, create it and design it, where it could be, again, sorry to keep bringing up the web, like the web, where there's a certain sort of framework, but then it became what it is based on all of the websites that people created, based on how people use it. So it may be something that, even though we're sort of all stating our preferences for what this thing is, it could sort of take on its own life based on, how it's used, which of course is the way that some technologies develop. So let's talk about, Anar, you're very much, of course, working with fashion, and fashion sort of leads to a larger topic, I think, which is identity, identity in the metaverse, given that, it could be, as Mark Zuckerberg calls it, an embodied internet, something that we're experiencing within rather than looking at from the outside. And we see a lot of activity already. So for example, I just read that Twitter bought a company called, I think it's called Faithmoji. Also Ready Player Me, which is an avatar company many of you are probably familiar with, has partnered with New Balance to sort of, bring fashion and identity, and branding, into their avatars. So I guess the question based on all of that is, how do you envision sort of identity, avatars, the interoperability of those identities that we form? How do you believe, or how do you think that sort of we should be thinking about that? How should that play out? And Anar, why don't we start with you, because of your sort of affinity and perspective in sort of digital and virtual fashion?
Oh my gosh, starting off with an easy question. I mean, fashion is a huge industry. I think everybody understands the role that fashion plays in all of our lives. Sometimes it plays a role of function when we are buying warmer clothing for a colder season. Sometimes it's just for pure fun. And I think something strange has happened with the advent of social media, where the relationship that we have with our clothes have shifted a lot away from function and more for social aspects, when you're able to very temporarily express different moods, or, attending different events, always in a different outfit. And I don't know, when did this trend start? Maybe it's from the blogging days, or maybe it's when high fashion started to have a much larger presence in our cultural sphere, and in terms of celebrities and how magazines and media outlets started to work. But the demand for fashion started to just outproportionally grow the supply that we can sustainably produce. So I think the place where digital fashion comes in is that it will allow us to continue to self-express and be able to experiment with different garments in virtual environments without having to actually put the strain on physical resources. And if anything, I think we're living at a time where technology in many ways is coming in at a perfect time to help us deal with the constraints that we have on resources in every single industry. But fashion being one of the biggest, and also one of the biggest polluters as well, I think is going to be a really great example of how the metaverse can assist us in this transition to hybrid digital and physical existence. And also from a business perspective, a lot of fashion brands right now are physical brands. There's very, very few brands that are digital first. However, the supply chain and the way that fashion actually produces their ideas is very much based on guessing work. There are some designers that come up with outfits, the fashion houses produce them, and then you have an arbitrary number of sizes and things that end up on the actual retail floor. So if you can digitize your outfits, not only can you have a better idea of which of these garments are going to be resonating with your audience, but it's going to allow you to essentially improve your predictive models and how you engage with global audiences at large.
Yeah, it's like kind of virtual prototyping of clothes that could be released in the real world, but prototyping in a more cost-efficient way. That's fascinating. Now, before we go on, Avi, I believe you're out there somewhere, and you might be back with operational volume. So if you are, please join us on stage.
Yeah, right there, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, hey.
Can you hear me?
Can hear you great.
Great. That's better than before. I don't know how to get on the stage.
Hey, Ryan, how does he teleport in on a PC or on a Mac?
So you can point in the direction you want to go, and then press F.
Yeah. No, that's not doing it.
Teleport.
No, I just switched to classic PC controls. So,
if you see the blue cursor in front of you, you can press F to teleport.
Not yet, no.
Looks like you're moving side to side.
Yeah, I'm using the classic PC controls because the other stuff wasn't working right. All the key bindings are a little strange here.
Well, so keep working on that. And Ryan, I'll
Why
give
don't I
you the
just talk
chance
from
to.
where I am? If you guys have questions, then I'll just be over here.
Okay, let's do that. Let's have you sort of be part of this discussion, but just sort of like over to the side. So Avi, we want to hear from you. We've heard from these guys. Have you been able to, while you were on that, listen to any of our discussion?
Just a little bit because I had to reboot my PC and try a couple of
Okay,
things.
no problem. So I will repeat the first sort of round of questions we did because we're starting a bit high level and then we're going to dive into what you're all up to. But one of the high level questions to kick it off was not to define the metaverse, but to sort of what are the hot button sort of components for you? A lot of people are talking about this. A lot of people point to the things they believe the metaverse should or shouldn't have, interoperability, privacy. So what are the sort of things for you that you point to, sort of the unsung heroes or the unsung sort of topics that you believe this thing we call the metaverse should possess?
Sure. And this is a little hard because I'm getting massive feedback. I'm hearing everybody like a second later. So I'll try to just talk for a second and not listen.
If you have a headset, that could eliminate that, but I don't want to slow you down there.
Headphones.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah. So it's definitely not that. So actually, I think if you listen to Tony Parisi, he's got this sort of 7 rules of the metaverse. He's been tweeting about those, and I think he's going to come up with an article pretty soon. I agree with everything he's said, and I'm not going to recount all 7, but that includes things people have already said about interoperable. And I think the most important thing is that ultimately it needs to be decentralized and essentially free. It's not going to take off the way the web is taken off unless it's open and free the way the web is taken off. But it's highly likely that for the first few years, because it's so expensive to build devices, it's so expensive to build new headsets, that these are going to be much more siloed experiences initially. I think it's almost inevitable if it's going to cost $1 billion to make these things happen. That's just not something that's going to start from an open source or even a government funded kind of bootstrap project. It's going to be something that private companies are going to want to do, and they're also going to want to see return on their investment. So it's going to be something that is not quite as open as we want. But if you look 5 to 10 years out, then I think it starts to fulfill the promise of what I think almost everybody wants, which is much more decentralized, open set of connections. And of course, the beginnings of that is just to make sure the interoperability works. Not everybody's going to choose to make their siloed worlds interoperable at first. That's normal. But eventually that's the thing that wins because it'll be the thing that's most popular.
Yeah. And thank you, Ryan, for solving that echo issue. And that's a good reminder, if anyone is on a PC, if you could put yourself on mute or use headphones if you're just in the audience. But anyway, Avi, thank you for those insights. And a question that sort of stems for that we discussed is sort of one thing that's often pointed to as either a foundation for or a model for this thing we're calling the metaverse is the web, in that it has sort of that balance of allowing for proprietary interests and incentive and walled gardens, but yet it also has the standards of interoperability, and that it has, common standards like HTTPS and common languages like HTML, and it has the browser. So in some ways that could be a model, but part of that question is important, which is the web isn't all great. I mean, is this an opportunity to sort of hit the reset button or rethink some of the things we don't like about the web, whether that be inequity or lack of privacy? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we got the privacy stuff really wrong when we built the web. I think
Right.
people weren't thinking much about, they were thinking about security. And the browsers are all sandbox, so hopefully no web app can come and take control of your computer. We've been pretty good about that, with a few exceptions, plugins in the past. But we didn't think about all the ways that we can be tracked and how even the remote servers can learn about us. Like, for example, every time you download an image, the fact that you downloaded that image could be recorded by that server. And if there's some identifying information about you that's sent to that server, and some, let's say, large web-based company can collect all that information. They can build up a profile of everything you do, everything you look at, whether you're signed in or not signed in. And so we need to think really carefully about security so that the model is going to be, I think, in the future, much more like we're all in our own walled gardens. We each have a walled garden. We can invite other people in if we trust them. We can bring content into our walled garden, but we're going to be extremely careful about the information that goes in and out of our personal walled gardens so that we can make sure that we're not leaking sensitive information out to people who are trying to collect it, and to make sure that malicious information is not coming in. And that even includes misinformation. How do you even define what that is sometimes? But we're going to have to get better about that, to know that when things come into our personal sphere of perception, that they're true, that they're trustworthy. Those are all going to be factors in the future that we're going to have to learn how to get right. And the internet was a good, maybe sort of a practice run at trying to get this right, so that we can learn all the problems in the worst way. But we're going to have to solve those. Otherwise, we're going to live in a world in which we can think of ourselves as, rather than being in our own walled gardens, we're going to be like little nodes connected to someone else's network, and all they really care about is the choices that we make in terms of what we buy and what we look at. And it's going to be, a little bit like the Matrix, in the sense that not that there's, not that we're all stuck in a virtual world, but that we're plugged into it, and that becomes our life. And we have a little time left before that becomes a reality, that we have a say in what happens. And so now is the time to really start laying the foundations for a much safer, and as you said, more inclusive world. I think that means also getting more people to sit at the table who are not raising their voices at the tables where these things are getting decided. They may be speaking up in other ways, but we need to be much more inclusive about making sure that we make sure everybody is accounted for and taken care of in the new system. We can do that. It's just going to be a matter of choice.
Yeah, and it's the inclusivity, it's the security. One thing I'll add to your list is, the business models that don't have so much incentive for those bad behaviors and sort of corrupt individuals towards that end of quarterly earnings, because it's collect data, and so that could be part of it too, is just sort of the incentive structures. Would that be fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm on record now as basically saying I think that Facebook's business model should be illegal. I think that rather than argue about whether they should be broken up or regulated, I think we should just basically say that it's not that advertising is illegal, but the collection of personal information in order to build up profiles about us, which are then used to try to persuade us and manipulate us into making certain decisions, that should be illegal, because individuals really have no transparency into how that's used. We have no control over how it's used. Even if we decide to opt out, we're still somehow included in those systems. Facebook seems to be building profiles about people who are not even active members. It's pervasive and it's corrupting. And when we have other things that are pervasive and corrupting, let's say gambling, or certain classes of drugs, we tend to step in with the government and say, no, that has to be, those certain things are illegal. Not that I'm in favor of making everything legal. But I think that when there's things that are being used against us, like what we saw with the, with the Oxy crisis, with people being prescribed medications they didn't need in order to become addicted to those things, that's absolutely illegal. The government should be stepping in and saying, no, that's actually too far, because the money incentive is too high, and the money generated is so high that it perverts the role of government. It can get people out of enforcement because they just can buy their way out of it. So we do have to take a pretty steep stand on that and say, no, enough is enough. We've seen this. We've seen how bad it is. Let's put an end to it.
Absolutely.
And I actually want to add to that, to just indicate how big the stakes are for essentially internet subsidizing, right? We're using the internet for free, but we're really being subsidized. Facebook, during their outage on, I think, whatever it was, Tuesday or Wednesday, they lost $6 billion. One day, they lost $6 billion. So that gives you the scope of how much it's worth to them, because we're not paying them, right? The advertisers are paying them. And I think, a big part of Web3 will be changing the incentives for behavior and for like the economy. What I'm also seeing with Web3 right now, which is I'm not a fan of, is the highly speculative people buying a JPEG for $300,000 and $1 million. Again, a large population is going to be left behind. It's the 1% of the Web3 that are now essentially transacting. I think what we have to do with the metaverse is actually create a system where everyone can earn, everyone can contribute, and everyone can create. Of course, you're going to have outliers. Of course, you're going to have the power law at work because people just have more resources, leverage, or skills. But we cannot have these lopsided entities just taking up, all the wealth essentially.
And to your point
I-
about Facebook, sorry, go ahead, Avi. Go ahead.
No, I was going to just, I totally agree with almost everything you said, except the first, which is we actually are paying for it. Even though it seems like it's free, the money that the advertisers are paying to Facebook comes from the products that we buy. So every product that you buy has been marked up just a little bit, right? A little bit more in order to pay for that extra advertising in order to get other people to buy the product. You've already paid for it, you've already bought it, but they've got to go get other people to pay for it. If you were to subtract out, all the money that Facebook is making from the cost of the products that we buy, then we would actually save money. We would pay less for everything, and that money would be back in our pockets. And we, instead of paying it to Facebook or to the product makers, we could be paying it into something like, let's say, Consumer Reports. Imagine that was expanded to cover all the products. So instead of advertising, we could actually have a service that tells us which products are good. It could actually review them and rate them. Not that it's a perfect service, but it tries to be objective as opposed to ads. So we would get the same information, but we'd get it from more trusted sources. We would pay a lot less money than we do today.
Yeah, and it's on a unit economic sense, to your point, we're paying for it, but also on a macro sense, societally, we certainly are. And back to the point about we always have to remind ourselves, it's that old saying, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And to Facebook, its constituents, its main constituent, it's advertisers, and we're secondary, because you follow the money. So let's thank you, Avi. That sort of brings you up to speed of where we are. So thank you for your insights as always. But let's jump back in where we were when we were talking about, and Anara, you had some great points about the sort of one main component in all of this will be the sense of fashion and identity. So let's sort of discuss how identity will work in this thing we're calling a metaverse. In its sort of manifestations today, such as these metaverse-like fiefdoms like Altspace, where I've chosen this shirt and this hat. I didn't put a lot of thought into it, but or something that someday is more interoperable. How are you each thinking about that in terms of how important identity will be, as a sort of currency or as a component of, compared with our sort of not mostly, but somewhat anonymous 2D web today, or Web 2? Ryan, why don't we start with you on that one?
Sure. So the way I see identity, and of course, this is very early on, so I'm probably completely wrong, but I see identity as like a two-part system. One part, you have the signature of your identity, which is really what we know right now as wallets. I see that as part of my identity because the things that I own, the addresses that represent so-called my identity, that's I think one part, which is the signature. And then the other part, I think, is the self-expression. Of course, Anar is a much better expert on that than I am. But if we really think about it, I grew up on MSN Messenger because I didn't actually grow up in the US. In the US, it was AIM, AOL. And I remember that even that small picture and even our status, that was like you could have like a status message. I would put in a lot of thought in expressing myself to my friends and potential people that were on that service. And so I think what's going to happen is as the metaverse becomes more prominent, more and more of our work and our leisure are going to shift to this metaverse, whether that's an AR metaverse or a VR metaverse. And so humans obviously have a need to share and have a need for belonging and a need to be unique and loved. And so I think self-expression is going to be paramount. And Nara's club on Clubhouse grew rapidly. I think now she's like 20,000 plus people that are members of it. And I think the reason for it is because it's the first real use case for NFTs. Self-expression is, I think, NFTs, yeah, you can speculate with images or whatever, but I think once you can buy things for your avatar you can take across metaverses. Initially, I believe it's going to be closed metaverses. Apple will have a metaverse, Facebook will have Horizon, Twitter will have a metaverse. Clubhouse is essentially an audio metaverse. You'd want to take those valued items along those metaverse, and I think your identity is going to be, the shell or the wallet that contains your aesthetic and your ownership in items.
So, Anar, I want to hear from you next on this because of your sort of work in fashion and identity. Of course, is going to be a key component. But first, I want to drill down into one thing you just mentioned, um, Ryan, which is the interoperability point, which is, of course, a word we're repeating a lot, but specifically in the context of interoperability with avatars, because I think that's certainly going to be a challenge when you have different worlds that are sort of styled differently. And one way that I think about this, and I want you guys to tell me if this is sort of too simplistic or if this conceptually makes any sense, is that we currently have the Unicode Consortium, right? And they sort of govern emojis. And it's, a piece of code that is interoperable across messaging apps and across the web. And if you, use an emoji that's, the tilted face kind of guy laughing or girl laughing, that shows up, it's styled differently based on the CSS of different, whether you're in Gmail or WhatsApp or wherever you are. But there's sort of a basic part of that translates. Could an identity system in the metaverse, if it is indeed to be interoperable, sort of follow a structure that's somewhat like that? Of course, it would be styled differently because when you're in Fortnite or any, game or experience built on Unreal Engine, it's obviously going to be different than if you jump into something that is styled differently, like Roblox or even something like Minecraft, which is the opposite end of the spectrum from a sort of granularity perspective. Does any of that make sense, or how do you guys think that interoperability could work?
So
I
from
would
a
say that
technical
I have a
perspective,
problem with companies that advertise being the one and only plug and play solution for you to take your avatar to all of the metaverses, because I don't think that's what people actually want to do. If you look at the way that we split up our identities in real life, we have our work persona and our professional life, we have our family life, our friends, then our hobbies and things that we do outside of that. Like none of our personalities or our, I guess, aspects of our identity are shaped by the same clothing or even the same environment or even the same group of people. So I might want to enjoy the simplicity of a Minecraft avatar whenever I am in that game, and I don't necessarily need to have to port my high fidelity metahuman to be in that environment to really feel like myself. So giving people the agency to decide what do they want to show up as in those environments, I think, is the very reason why interoperability matters, because it is essentially telling to the platforms that you may have your own business reason why you want to be the only solution and to be the one that everybody uses, which I think is a bit selfish. I mean, like, yes, of course you want to succeed as a company, but I think creating an ecosystem that is incredibly seamless and allows you to do exactly what you aim to do as easily as possible, I think is a bigger technical challenge to create, because as we know, file types and all of the inconsistencies in the way that we actually currently set up our 3D environments, which the amount of abbreviations that are present there is just crazy, I think is more important to prioritize.
And before you guys jump in, one other quick kind of concept to overlay on this question is, will we indeed have a situation like what Facebook has sort of mandated, at least in its walled garden, which is you are your own identity, as opposed to anonymous or opposed to having 10 different identities, and there are sort of hacks around that. But for the most part, is that good or bad to have it? You are who you are wherever you go, and you be identified as such. I guess in one sense that sort of eliminates some bad behavior, but also is that sort of too overbearing in terms of wanting to be another entity for a day. That could be some of the benefits of this thing we're all envisioning. So Ryan, you were going to say something on that just overall question of identity and interoperability of avatars.
sure. So I see that there needs to be as a coder, I like to have separations of concern. And I think that the the actual code that defines an asset. So say for example, I have a digital cat. We all like cats on the internet, right? And I have a digital cat. If you're a dog person, you have a dog. That dog is going to look very different in Minecraft as in Fortnite, or maybe even like a Ready Player One type of photo real high production environment. And I think that the value of interoperability is essentially saying, hey, there needs to be a separation between ownership of an item and what that item is rendered as in a environment. So I can, for example, have my cat in Altspace, right? And Altspace should respect essentially the instructions I give it to render my cat. If my cat wears a funny hat, it should have a funny hat in all these spaces. It might be blocky in Minecraft or really cool looking in Fortnite. And so I think the same way we have HTML and CSS and these browsers are essentially parsing the code and displaying it in their native sense, I think that's what we would need, to have real value in interoperability. And interoperability is actually also important to essentially transform the incentive models for companies. So right now, for example, Epic Games is a so-called proponent of an open metaverse, yet their Fortnite currency is not open. It is V-Bucks and it is isolated in their game. The skins that you buy, the ninja skins that you buy in Fortnite are isolated. So people should put their money where their mouth is and actually start building infrastructure that allows you to essentially take that Fortnite ninja skin you spent $90 on and bring it into your meeting on Monday. I wouldn't recommend it, but that should be possible. And so I think that's really difficult for the Web2 business model, right? Because the Web2 business model is really a marketplace of the supply and demand. And if you don't have control over the supply and you don't wall it in, what is the value of your platform? YouTube would be a whole different ballgame if they didn't actually control where videos go. And so I think that's going to be very tricky. And whoever figures it out first and can actually properly monetize it, they will be very successful in the metaverse.
Great. Avi, what are your thoughts on this topic?
I got a bunch. I think just to try to be brief, though, I think probably the most important thing to think about with interoperability, I think the point's saying that, if I'm going between vastly different universes, it doesn't really make sense all the time to be able to translate everything I have and what I look like. If I'm playing, in a D&D type world, I'm playing a dwarf and I jump into a 1940s film noir world, it doesn't make sense that I would still be a dwarf with a magic sword. I would want to be appropriate for that world. I've joked the first thing that would happen is I'd get arrested, and that would sort of ruin the rest of the story. So it does make sense that we can have different personas for different spaces, and even the same space we might want to have multiple personas, as was said. I think that's a good point. We have our work personas and our home personas. Also, it's just a small point about Facebook's policy, I think, is that they want to know who you are, but I don't think that they'll necessarily prohibit you from being more than one person. Like you could, if you wanted to have two personas in VR, that's probably okay by them as long as they know who you are, and they can attribute everything you do to the right account because they just want to link all your data together. And it may or may not stop bad behavior. I think the thing that stops bad behavior is social accountability, and the thing that has Facebook in its favor is the fact that most people know each other in real life, and so they're going to hopefully behave better in the virtual world because they know each other in real life. But if they don't know each other, you can get a lot of griefing, a lot of really bad behavior. And anyway, bottom line though, with the one thing I think that we should mention about this interoperability and moving avatars around is, I don't think the goal is necessarily to make it so that you create your avatar once and that's it. It works everywhere. I mean, that would be a nice thing, but it doesn't really take that long to make an avatar. It's not, unless you have to go get Blender and, do everything yourself in some of these systems. But the most important thing is letting people be who they are. If we're in a system that's constrained, that, it says your birth certificate says you're male, therefore you must be male, or we don't support all the different types of religious clothing various people have because it's just not supported. That's much more of a imposition on the diversity issue that we've talked about before. The systems all have to be, roughly equally open to things that the designers didn't think about when they first created the system. And that means all these things uniquely are, those are the things that are probably the most important to carry across. But it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Some of these things are pretty hard to add. I'll give you an example of one of the things that's hard to do. So let's imagine we're in a more AR type situation, which is what I tend to focus on more these days. And you're walking down the street and you see somebody who has specifically selected virtual clothing. they have, they have something that says whenever, somebody in a certain category, let's say a friend, sees me, they want to see me with my magic hat and my magic robe, just to pick something stupid. And the question is, how do we actually make that happen in a way that preserves privacy? How do we know that the person walking down the street towards us is in our network and that they have these preferences for how they want to appear? It's very hard to imagine a privacy preserving way to do that. We don't want everybody to broadcast their identifiers to everybody, because then all the little snoopers out there are going to go collect those too. So we have to be able to design something that says, here's who I am, here's my identity, and here's where you're allowed to use it. But it's detached from all this other information so that the automated systems can't discover this, but we can still allow people to see each other and actually be wearing the correct virtual augmentations around each other. And that is an incredibly hard challenge to pull off. You could cheat and do it in a way that doesn't preserve privacy, but to do it right, I think is going to take us years to get right.
Mm-hmm. And once you start to think about all of these sort of angles and the things that you always do a good job bringing up, you really start to realize the levels of complexity and just all of these different sort of categories across the board that we're going to have to solve, and it will take years or decades. Now, I want to signal the audience that we're almost out of time, so raise your hand if you have a question. But what I'll do is I'll ask one more question to you guys, and just kind of get ready. If you do have a question, raise your hand, and we'll go from there. But staying on this thread, sort of with respect to identity and avatars. One thing, I'm always looking for sort of current analogs to sort of, conceptualize this still abstract thing that we're all talking about. And, today on Web2, we have sort of websites almost as like the unit of currency of sort of ownership. And we go to a domain registrar and we have our website that is registered with ICANN. Could we be thinking about this question of identity in similar ways, that whether it's one identity or sort of your tray or stable of identities, as you mentioned, Avi, is that something that might become the sort of unit of currency, for lack of a better term, where you're sort of registering these versions of yourself, and then that, rather than thinking of it in just I own this website or I own that domain, it's more of the sort of the moving entities of the people they represent becomes that organizational structure. Would that be a fair look at it, or anything to add or refute that?
I think that's reasonable. I think that is in some sense what the big companies are trying to do with all of their universal login systems, right? Log in with Facebook, log in with Google. All these companies want to do that, but I think most of them want to do it for the wrong reasons. They want to do it because they want to be able to mine that data. But if we could have such a service from a company we trust that isn't going to mine that data and use it against us, I think that's good. I think people are also starting to say, like as we talk about Web3 and decentralization, that maybe it shouldn't be a company, but it should be a distributed protocol that allows information to be stored in a way that is hopefully safer, that it isn't mineable to everybody, and it is under our control, but we also don't have to risk the leadership of the company changing, because we have to consider they may be good today, they may be pro-privacy today, but 10 years from now, they might have a whole new CEO and they might be completely different. And we don't want to necessarily be in bed with one company for our entire life. So we want to be basing this based on who we trust at the moment. And a distributed system might be better. It still has risks. With all these distributed systems, there's risks of the 51% attacks. Like the system is distributed, but if someone can amass enough power, they can take the network. And that's, I don't think there's any perfect solution yet, but hopefully we're figuring these things out.
Absolutely.
We have a question from the audience. If you guys are ready to take questions.
So let me. Looks like there's a question.
Justin,
so,
Justin,
I will be able to turn your sound up. Or Mayung, did you already do that?
Yeah, I already did that. Yeah.
Oh, good. Good. Go ahead, Justin. Thank you.
Yep. You can hear you, Justin.
Yep.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hey, Justin Quibby. I actually work on Live View in Google Maps.
Hey, Justin. Good to see you.
And yeah, good to see you folks. Always love the conversation. My question is, when you think about the metaverse and this idea of movable content between platforms, then you start, like, I have to ask kind of the Disney or the Lord of the Rings or any other IP holders' rights in that sort of environment. And I'm curious for the panel's thoughts on, how how in an open metaverse or just the metaverse in general will intellectual property be handled when it's visual and can be transposed between surfaces very, very easily? Thanks.
And in a common law system, it will that sort of the case law isn't there yet, right, Justin, to sort of define how those things, and that's another challenge to your question. But if anyone wants to jump in on that question, go for it.
I'll
Sure.
have a
Yeah,
quick
I
answer.
mean, it's an
All
incredibly
three of you.
difficult question to solve. If you look at what happened with a recent campaign, so Hermes is a brand that essentially is the creators of the Birkin bag. And there was a group of designers that created a baby Birkin, which was a miniature version of the original Birkin bag that sold for, I think, upwards of 5 ETH. And Hermes had nothing to do with the drop. The iconic symbol of that bag was able to still be communicated by those artists, and they were able to keep essentially the profits of that sale. So when it comes to being able to verify that the work that you've created, that your brand essentially stays consistent, I think that's a very similar issue that NFTs are encountering right now as well, where technically anybody can repost an image and pretend to be you and try to go through the sale. So it does kind of fall into the hands of the person that's buying the artwork to make sure that this is legitimate, that this is the actual author. But there currently are no processes that actually are preventative and are actually going to catch this. I've seen a couple examples where I believe it's DeviantArt or something, or some other image platform that is starting to use AI to essentially scan and machine learning to scan images to essentially warn you and say, okay, we found a duplicate of a similar artwork present. But until this process becomes more robust, I think we're going to see a lot more counterfeits, which is something that fashion struggles with even in the real world.
So from a technical perspective, I think that question has regulatory implications, judicial implications, and technical implications, and probably many more. And that's why we really have centralized organizations such as USPTO that kind of govern, patents, copyright, and trademarks. And if the question is really from a technical perspective, how do we codify that? How do we create systems that actually can detect that? And it's, YouTube, for example, has attempted to create the content ID system that essentially creates a signature of every video and every song and every asset that labels hold. And it scans, every video on upload and even throughout the lifetime of the video for that essentially proprietary signature. And the hard part, I think, is going to be where, a video or song, that's essentially a 1D, maybe 2D signal. But when you have the metaverse, you have so much more volume, so everything is so much larger. And you can modify a mesh, and would that mean that the signature is different? And so a good example maybe from recent times is Apple's CSAM detection of sensitive images having to do with child protections. Systems that essentially create a hash or a scan and have a signature of an asset, that should then be scanned. So there needs to be like a protocol that whenever you mint something, something similar to a content ID system would have to scan the signature. And if it's a very close match, then there might need to be a different protocol or layer that really checks to make sure that someone's rights are not infringed. And if they are, or if that's authorized, then there's protocols such as the ERC 1155, where you can have partial ownership, and the brand can then get royalties from such an asset if it is authorized. But I think the technical system of that is going to be a phenomenal engineering feat, but there's also very many judicial and regulatory issues associated.
Avi, any thoughts you want to jump in?
Yeah. One quick add. I think what Ryan was saying at the end there was I think I agree with it. That the music industry has been way ahead on this, also behind, but way ahead in having to deal with this earlier than every other kind of content. And we've seen every type of solution thrown at the problem about how to make sure that the original musicians get their royalties. We've seen DRM be a colossal failure. We've seen DMCA takedowns of various things that have music in them, and if there's one thing that YouTube can reliably get, I think it's music. The video is even easier trick it by blurring it or cropping it and things like that can fool it. I think that the solution is going to be, I think what was just alluded to is that there'll be more of a system in place that allows for mashups. So it doesn't try to stop mashups. It actually encourages mashups to say, you can take something that existed before and add to it. As you're adding value to it, let's just figure out technologically how to make sure that the original creator gets some cut, the IP owner gets a cut, and the cut may just be of credit. It may not be of money. And the way I would slice it is to say, if the end use of this IP doesn't make any money, it's okay. Just flow the credit back to everybody who contributed to it. But if it does make money, let's say it's used in a movie or it happens to become a viral hit, then the money flows back in those cases. And it means we have to just sort of give up on this idea that if I'm just going to copy something for personal use and it's never going to make any money, let it go. There's not a lot of harm in that. Let people copy things. But let's only go after the cases where people are making serious money off of copies of things, derivatives of things, and then figure out how to strategically do this so that the people who need to make the money from these things do make the money, and encourage them to actually give back to the system and put things out there proactively so that we can actually have instead of a today, which is NFTs are oriented around scarcity, and there's one copy of something that we're all fighting for. Let's go for a world in which we have an abundance of IP, and it's easy to share, easy to use, but we figure out a good way to monetize that so everybody wins.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks for a great question, Justin. So we're a bit over time here. So I guess I'll pose the final question to you all, which is, we hear a lot. There are a lot of editorials. Every press release you pick up, the word metaverse is everywhere. A lot of it is thoughtful. Some of it is just overuse and marketing speak. What do you believe? What do you all believe is sort of missing from the discussion? When you're sort of reading metaverse articles, what is the common thread that you believe is missing most and people aren't talking about? Why don't we start? We'll just go down the line here. We'll start with you, Ryan, and go down.
So I may be biased, but I think education is still very much lacking. I'm filling a very small niche with Apple AR, but just to think about it, I registered an ENS domain, like the .eth domain, and it took way longer than I would use for Namecheap or GoDaddy. And because I'm technical, I understand what to do, and you have to connect the wallet, and the browser has to be Web3 enabled, like all these different steps. But I think it's unfortunate that the population that currently does not enjoy tremendous wealth on the internet will likely also not enjoy tremendous wealth in the metaverse if we don't have educational mechanisms to bring everyone up to speed. And so I think right now the metaverse thing is very speculative and opportunistic. I would love to see more education where it's like, hey, I've read this great article. I have this knowledge on how to do this. I'm going to share that with the world. I'm going to create educational content to help other people also tap into this opportunity, because I do believe the metaverse is a tremendous opportunity that very few, like our generation is really fortunate to have that. But I think inequality and inequity is going to be a big play, and so I would like to see more education.
Inara, your thoughts on the unsung components of this thing we're calling the metaverse?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone present here today is primarily pro metaverse. Like, we all understand the interest that it actually garners around itself. But I think a lot of the times the articles can sometimes be one-sided and only talk about the benefits, and they don't really cover the aspects of the metaverse that might have some drawbacks. Usually we start to address those after they've happened or after the fact. So I would have loved to see more balanced reporting, because a lot of the marketing or a lot of the articles that are written around the metaverse sometimes can sound like press releases. Like, they're just like, this company's accept something so amazing, and everything's always so amazing and it's so innovative, and it can just feel a bit dry. So I do think like marketers play a very important role in popularizing a concept, and now the metaverse, I think, have reached much further communities, and people have started to gain interest in it. Maybe if it wasn't anywhere adjacent to their field, and they're starting to see how it's become relevant. So I am glad that that is the effect that the the barrage of articles that we've been seeing is having. But I would love to see more balanced reporting on the drawbacks as well.
Yeah, and Avi, I've heard you comically describe this sort of overuse of the word, almost like the Smurfs, the word Smurf that was in the '80s cartoon, The Smurfs, where it's just Smurf, 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 Smurfs. It's a verb, it's an adjective, it's everything, and it becomes meaningless. But you get the final word, Avi.
Yeah, to me, the sort of building on those other things, I totally agree with that. The biggest, most common definition of the metaverse that I see today is as a verb, which means to take over ideas that may have previously existed, but start calling them metaverse. And it's viral in the sense that if you're not calling your stuff the metaverse, you feel like you're being left out. So you got to start calling it the metaverse. And pretty soon we don't know what we're talking about because we're just not being specific anymore. We're calling everything the Smurf, and therefore we lose distinction between which of these things are going to be happening now this year, which of these things are going to be happening in 5 years, which of these things are going to be happening in 10 years, which of these things, like was said, which of these things are going to have problems and need a lot of work to make sure that we don't introduce them with those problems. We can't necessarily fix them later. And so let's make sure that we're being really careful when we talk about this. And I think it's okay to be excited. It's great to be excited about the future and seeing that convergence that's going to happen. But let's also be realistic about the metaverse when we talk about it and cover at least the differences between the different things we're talking about and be just a little bit more clear about what we mean when we say it.
That's great advice. And we are indeed at sort of an exciting time. It's an uncertain time for this topic. It's a scary time, but I think it's the insights from folks like all of you that really will help us to sort of, look at it in the right framework and build it responsibly. So thank you for your insights and your continued sort of chorus on this topic. So everyone, please join me in thanking the panel. Silent claps. And Mayung, over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you guys so much. That was an amazing discussion. I hope everyone here got really great information from this discussion. And it's going to be recorded. It is being recorded and live streamed, and we'll post up the video from the session probably in the next week or so on the Augmented Reality Expo. I'm sorry, Augmented World
It's the
Expo.
AWE YouTube channel.
Yeah, YouTube
Correct.
channel. So it should be available up there in the next week or so. So anyway, thanks. Big round of applause for our panelists and for Mike for moderating the discussion.
And I'll remind each of you, if you're sticking around for networking, to unamplify your voice, or you'll be sort of disproportionately loud in the networking room.
Yeah,
but
so
thank you.
feel free to stick around and network, meet. I don't know if any of the panelists will be around to have discussions with or answer any more questions, because I know there were a couple more questions from the audience that we didn't get a chance to get to. So please feel free to stay and mingle. So thank you again, and we'll see you. And don't forget to volunteer, register for the event in Santa Clara in November, and hope to see you again next time. Take care.